Meyer of the Partially Examined Life, and I'm here with Michael Burgess from the UK.
Good evening.
We are your hosts today. You didn't know you were going to be a host, did you, Michael?
I am always prepared to be a host.
For the Aftershow on episode 113, where Stephen West, our regular host, is, we don't even know. I did not think I was even going to be on this. In fact, I just got finished recording 3 hours on Schopenhauer just now. So I'm not going to be very coherent here. But let's do our best to be a little interesting. And if nobody joins us within the next half hour, then we'll just wrap it up and we'll say this is the whole thing, and it'll be a great disappointment to the 5 people that watch this.
Well, you probably get. I mean, over a few. I mean, these things last years, don't they?
Perhaps. I'm not even actually seeing your image anymore, Michael. Since we're
no, that was half deliberate. My camera's fallen.
Okay. All right. Well, you listened to the episode. What'd you think?
Right. Well, I don't know. What should I think? It's good. It was good. It was a bit confusing in the beginning. There's a lot of things going on, and it sort of evened out. Do you want some criticism on the episode or on the content?
Yes, let's talk about content. Let's go into detail on what the approach to the parables. Should we even be bothering to study this? I mean, what did you think of this? Is this something that you had considered to be legitimate philosophy in the past?
What legitimate philosophy? That's an interesting question. Yes. Well, I mean, if anyone is going to consider Kierkegaard or anything of that kind of legitimate philosophy, then you're going to consider Jesus Christ as engaging in Jesus Christ. That's a very loaded term. Jesus, if you prefer.
Yeshua. Hey, yeah. Number 3, Ken. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, you turned off you just muted yourself, Ken. And now it says Michael and you are muted.
Sorry, I think that's fixed now. Where were we? Something legitimate philosophy. Yes, well, I think a lot of people have taught through example and parable of a kind. So I don't see why we should deprive Jesus of that opportunity. I'm not convinced that his philosophy is necessarily better than, let's say, Kierkegaard's or anything like that. But it's nevertheless legitimate philosophy, I think.
So Ken, any initial reactions from the episode of the whole practice of why you might want to bring the parables into a philosophy discussion?
Yeah. I actually posted up a document on the forum for this, and one of the things I've been thinking about since then is that the parables are a little thin on specific doctrine. I think it's a challenge to understand how the Christian Church got some of their various doctrinal principles out of purportedly a teacher who had such difficult things to say.
Well, I think it's very easy to misunderstand the parables. And I think also, in fact, when you were talking about that lost sheep parable, Mark, I think even then it was misunderstood on the podcast, because I went and had a look at the various different translations of that parable because I thought it didn't make any sense to me. And I found that the original Greek says something like, the majority of the sheep have been left out sort of in an open area on a hillside, and then if one gets lost, then you go and find a lost one and you're very happy about it. Whereas the translation you were using said the word wilderness, and it seemed like that if you left them, it would all disappear. So I think the reading of the lost sheep parable, for example, even went wrong on the podcast. So I think it's very easy to misread these things.
And the scholarly barriers to reading them correctly, apparently with the linguistic and other background knowledge you need, it seems nearly insurmountable.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very odd to imagine that any person living after the 1st century would be in a close enough position to the Christianic Jews of the 1st century to really understand what was going on.
It looks like we have a new participant. Let's unmute Francine. Let's let her talk.
Sorry, that was just because the mic was rumbling.
think you're muted, Francine. Oh, nah. I'm not sure how to unmute you.
She can unmute herself.
All right, well, hopefully those audio issues will work themselves out. Ken, other thoughts?
Yeah, the one of the things I worked on after listening to the podcast was to separate the level of the practical events that are depicted in the parable from an attempt to assign spiritual or theological significance to it, or even moral significance, the way you'd expect in a fable. And as Michael was saying, these just the ground level of the parable, just what is it trying to say about the people in the story, can be very tricky. And I thought that was actually a worthwhile clue to what the parables are for. That the people in these parables often look like they're doing something unreasonable, like the shepherd who leaves a bunch of his sheep on the hillside and then goes off after one. So that would seem to be taking a big risk for maybe not so much reward, and on the face of it, that's an irrational behavior. So I think that's actually a useful clue.
Well, I disagree. On that specific example, I think what I picture in my head when I hear that parable is not someone doing something irrational. It's that a large number of sheep. I think, because I'm from England, where we have a tremendous number of sheep on hillsides in random places, and you sort of just go there and they're just wandering around. They're not getting lost. But if one sheep goes fields and fields away, then it doesn't seem terribly unreasonable to leave all your normal sheep playing around as they usually do on the hillside. You see, so even that, it didn't strike me as someone doing something unreasonable.
Well, but I want to emphasize the issue of risk, and I also want to say that it isn't necessarily unreasonable, and I think that's also part of the story. So that the practical reason, the ordinary ground level structure of these stories, is somebody doing something, questionable. And in fact, the story that's highlighted in Paul Tillich's chapter 1 of the reading, I thought was a great example, because Jesus goes to visit the Pharisee, and meanwhile the Pharisee is entertaining Jesus for dinner, and a woman of the street comes in, and we all know the story. She's very kind to Jesus, and the Pharisee is nonplussed. He's surprised that Jesus is allowing this interaction with the woman of the street. So what I want to say is that the Pharisee being surprised that Jesus would make this particular choice, to interact with the woman rather than only with his host. To be surprised at someone else's behavior, I think, is one of the recurring and significant elements of the stories, even at the ground level, the interpretation of ordinary events before assigning any moral or theological significance to them.
Your microphone's, I think, just slightly adjacent to your mouth, so it's getting lots of wind feedback. If you like.
Okay.
So I think what you're saying is entirely correct. That to even know what to put it like this, to know what the emotional economy of the parable would be. I'm not sure if anyone heard that. But
I can hear you.
Good. So to know what the emotional economy of the parable should be, that is to say, when you hear this, you should feel this. When you hear this, you should feel that. This is how you should operate. That is completely mysterious, because you don't know the conventions of the time. You don't know if the Pharisee was being unreasonable, if they were being reasonable. It turns out, in my reading of this, he was actually being ill-mannered, because he didn't kiss Jesus as a greeting, and he didn't offer him some water for his feet and things. So even you need to know the deep social conventions that Jesus is playing with in some of these parables to even understand where your emotional responses should be. And then once you've laid out that, only then can you begin to try and understand what the implications should be. And in situations where he's deliberately making this emotionally ambiguous, then we have an even larger problem, because we don't even know if our reading is leading us into emotional ambiguity, or that was his original intent behind his parables emotional ambiguity. And I think we've seen that certainly with the sheep thing, where some people are saying, well, no, it's ambiguous. I think it's clear, but it's difficult to decide on that question just from the text.
So, since the barriers to understanding the meant interpretation are so high, and a lot of the meant interpretation, given how different than we are of the original audience, it's going to be very off base from where we're at this point. I guess part of what I was trying to suggest on the podcast is that a more creative hermeneutic approach is called for. I'm just trying to figure out whether, in doing that exercise, there was anything to be gotten out of it as a philosopher. That's certainly not the way we normally think of a text. Like, if I'm trying to figure out what Schopenhauer meant, well, I might sort of give up at some point and say, well, I don't really care if he meant exactly that, but what this brings out in me is something fruitful that I'm going to run with that. And whether or not I can attribute that to Schopenhauer, in some ways it's a boon that, even though I might run off my own interpretation of something that maybe is, from just a very shallow reading, which is all I had time for at the time, and we as normal people immerse yourself as a scholar and just make this person's work your life, you're necessarily getting an incomplete picture and using your own bases of understanding as the launching point. And then the original text, though, you could always go back to it. You could always read more secondary sources about it. It ends up being an endless well of hermeneutic wealth, perhaps. But still, you get benefit out of it just from your own creative acts launching off of it, based on however incomplete, however inadequate understanding you can get. So I think that works pretty well with these parables, but again, I'm not really sure how coming away from the episode, other than this is kind of a neat exercise, whether I came out with anything, a new philosophical nugget from Jesus himself as opposed to from Tillich and Presting, who I think I did get some things from.
I agree. It's very hard for us to get anything from these parables of Jesus, and I think I was kind of surprised at how tough it is compared to how easy it seems sometimes for the pastor on Sunday morning to get quite a bit out of one of these parables. But I think that may have come from any particular speaker who wants to refer to the parables just to use them as examples, can pick out whatever is convenient for their own story. On the other hand, there's my favorite example of how to get something philosophically significant out of a biblical text is Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling, where he goes through the story of Abraham, and he's basically inventing existentialism out of that story. And his analysis is later picked up by Sartre to make the point about anxiety and the necessity of an individual acting without really knowing in what philosophers would call an epistemically significant sense. What's going to be the outcomes of their actions, or what's the justification of their actions. But
Ken, just before you continue, would you mind just taking the microphone away from your mouth and speaking louder?
Okay.
Just so I'm having difficulty catching some words.
Yeah. Is that any better?
Yes.
Okay.
If it's just away from you, quite away from your mouth, but you speak louder, then I think you'll be still caught.
Yeah, I can bend it in a couple of ways. This is the first time I've tried to use this microphone speaking.
Yeah, that's very clear. That's much better.
Much better. Okay. Yeah. So I was just mentioning Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling, and he really works hard on the Abraham example, which is also and that's a very strong example of someone appearing to do something that is legitimately judged, horrifying. It's morally very questionable for a father to even plan to sacrifice his son, but Abraham picks it up, and understanding how God and Abraham can participate in this story, and for that to be an example to the rest of mankind, that's quite a challenge. And I think Kierkegaard does a brilliant job of it. But he does end up with some challenging philosophical conclusions as well.
So the question we're trying to answer at the moment, just to be clear, for me, is there something directly philosophical to be gained from these parables themselves, and if so, from what kind of reading would that be got?
Yeah, what I'm saying is we'd have to be like Kierkegaard.
Right. No, I mean that's fine. I think so. So there's lots of different kinds of philosophical texts, right? I mean, you can't read Searle or Quine in the same way you can read Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, nor can you read Kierkegaard or Nietzsche in the same way that you would read Confucius or someone like that. From the Chang Tzu, whatever the name of that text is called, which I believe you read a while ago, didn't you? So, I mean, all of these things are doing what? Well, they're engaged in an account of how things are, how things hang together in one sense or another, how things hang together in the world, how they hang together morally, how they hang together socially. And if we want to just say philosophy is a kind of reflective activity where we ask those kind of questions, then yes, they're all doing philosophy. And I think we gain something from Jesus' parables insofar as we bring the tools of philosophy in whatever domain to bear on that particular piece of text. I mean, you have to bring the tools of analytic philosophy to read a Quinean text, and equally you have to bring the tools of sort of Eastern philosophy to read an ancient Eastern text. You can't use the same kind of knowledge base, the same kind of intellectual base, the same kind of reading in order to get from the text what its potential is in terms of its philosophical content. So, I mean, I do think that there are deeply philosophical things to be gained from this. I mean, the liberation theology reading of the talents, the parable of the talents, I find the most persuasive account of it. I find that is actually perhaps something that's being got at. The rich person in that story is being vilified by Jesus. You know, he's talking about interest and payments being got from people, and the attack that the rich person makes on this servant who doesn't invest the money is, I think, should be seen as a bad thing, as his expression of anger at someone doing something that is sinful, right? So the rich man wants to do something sinful, and the person doesn't engage in that activity, and the rich man becomes angry. So things of that kind, you're immediately getting into social critique, you're immediately getting into questions about what justice is, all of that kind of stuff. And that's prompted by these parables, but they're not system building they're not system building attempts, right? Jesus was not a system builder, but nor were many philosophers. I mean, you might say that the example in the Republic of Gordon's ring or Gorgon's ring, something like that, where
Gyges, yes.
the Gyges, right? Either the Gordon or the Gyges ring. That's right. So the Gyges ring, where people are, invisible and they can go and do whatever they like, and the question is, are people still moral, roughly speaking, in that situation? That's equally a motivating parable for philosophy, and the same goes for Plato's cave and things. Both equally beguiling, unclear, potentially self-deceiving if you read too much into them, I think, especially with Plato's cave. So there's all sorts of things going on in all different kinds of philosophy, and I think we should still broadly include attempts at starting to think about ideas through the use of stories as a sort of proto-system philosophy, if not a systemic philosophy itself.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think it's interesting on the one hand to compare the parables in the New Testament to more specifically philosophical texts, which are systematic, but might use examples or stories like the cave or the divided line or the way of ascent from the Symposium. On the other hand, it's interesting to compare Jesus' parables to another form that was well known in the classical world, which was Aesop's fables.
Mm-hmm.
And these are mentioned at times by Aristotle. And now, one of the questions I think is worthwhile is: are Jesus' parables intended to operate in the same way as Aesop's fables, where we hear the story and draw a moral from it? Somebody did well, somebody did badly. We should imitate some people, and we should not imitate others. Or is Jesus trying to say something bigger, try to say something more than just, well, I want you to love your neighbor as yourself, and here's an example, like the Good Samaritan, or I want you to become fishers of men. And so we have, on the one hand, a comparison between the parables and fables versus the parables and straightforward philosophy. And
Well, the fables are, I think, in themselves quite Victorian moralizing tales. That is to say, the parameters of the successive fables is moral goodness and moral badness. Whereas I think it's quite right when you look at Kierkegaard's analysis of Abraham and Isaac, for example, that you have to transcend the categories of the ethical, right? You have to reach out to something that is non-ethical in order to understand how Jesus is operating here. So you take, for example, the one you gave of the Pharisee and the potential prostitute. Doesn't say what she is, but the woman of ill repute. Now, what Jesus is doing there is forgiving her. Now, forgiveness is something that does not take into account good and evil in any of the traditional senses. You can't forgive a person within the framework of good and bad, because a person who does something bad is punished. A person who does something good is rewarded. If we to use the standard moralizing framework. So what Jesus, I think, is consistently doing, certainly with his ethical tales, is saying something like God is a source of forgiveness, or another word would be maybe what's the word I'm looking for? R, begins with R. But anyway, there's a sort of being able to transcend and recover and do away with all the bad things that happened. So you really need to, I think, so they may function in the same way as a little moral tales, but then we have completely and radically different moral, ethical, religious implications.
Yeah, and one of the clues, I think, is very explicit in some of these texts, where Jesus doesn't just launch into the parable. He sets up the parable deliberately and with a simile, and he says, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And then comes the parable. For example, the merchant and the pearl of great price, or the shepherd and the sheep. And there's an explicit attempt on the part of the speaker, Jesus, to say that he's trying to talk about something spiritual and theological, and one of the grand structures of the Christian moral scheme, and then launches into the parable. So there's an invitation there to see the parable as involving much more than just earthly behavior. So.
Yes, that's right. I mean, so the word I was thinking of before is redemptive.
Okay.
That's something redeeming. Obviously, Christ the Redeemer, but and of course, redemption and forgiveness are not ethical categories in any of the traditional sense. Yes, they're analogous. Yes, they're disanalogous. Yes, they're analogous in some ways. That's that, I guess.
Well, one of the things I pick up on in some of the parables is that in some of them there's a very explicit financial element, such as the field with the treasure buried, where the merchant finds the treasure and then runs off and sells everything he's got to buy the field. Or the pearl of great price is a similar story. It's very much about money, and and it doesn't stop there. The prodigal son has a lot to do with having a lot of money and wanting your inheritance, and then going out and blowing it all.
That's right. Yeah.
which
Do you think it has anything to do with the wealth of his audience? I mean, I was reading the parable of where the buried treasure, and I was reading that was some prominent fantasy of the time, that it was a thing that field workers would dream about, that somebody had buried treasure somewhere. So perhaps he was trying to perhaps had something tied to the, not necessarily just to the religious feelings of the Jewish people at the time, but something tied to that particular community of low-paid people. But, you know.
There's a lot of possibilities in here, and one of the things that's significant, I think, in picking among the possibilities for which could be pointing in this theological direction, I think it's significant that the buried treasure parable is, I think it's in the same story as the pearl great price.
It is, yeah.
So they're put up in parallel to each other, and one of the things I actually have a background in microeconomics, decision theory. So risk and reward calculations are prominent to me, maybe more than they should be. But I was a little bit surprised, having seen all these parables in childhood, that this financial aspect really struck me reading them again this time. But
there does seem to be a preoccupation with interest and wealth, and in ways that do seem financialized for the time, overtly, in ways that you might not expect from even people in later periods to have established that kind of thinking. But I wonder how much we're bringing that analysis to it. But it does seem, I do agree, it does seem to be glaring and there.
Well, one of the places I'm hoping to get with this is to read at least some of the parables as a hint to his own audience as to what kind of risk Jesus is asking them to take to leave their other way of life and leave Judaism behind and become a Christian. And
well, Jesus isn't asking any of these people to become Christians.
Well, the gospel writers are.
It's not even clear the gospel writers are. Maybe John, but certainly Matthew and Mark are Jews. Then and even Paul, in his 7 epistles, thinks of himself as a Jew, not as a Christian. That doesn't come until much later.
We could get into a detailed historical context, and the text of the Gospels, I think, is significantly divorced from the real historical context.
Well, all I mean to
I would
say
want to
is
get into confusion
the principle of Christianity is that you believe that Jesus is the Savior, the Redeemer. Everything's about Jesus. Isn't Jesus amazing? Believe in Jesus. That's Christianity. I don't think Jesus ever had any idea that that's what his idea was all about the kingdom of God. It had nothing to do with himself. He was bringing the message, and you had to behave this way and transform yourself and all of this kind of thing. So I just didn't want to ladle on to Jesus the idea that he himself thought of himself as establishing a religion in which he is the apotheosis, literally. So he's asking people to become Jews in a different way, which we might call Christian, but that would imply that those Jews somehow took Christ to be the Savior, and I think they may have taken him to be the Messiah, but not Savior in this whole Christianized sense of a religion about a cult of a person. I don't think he was trying to establish a cult of a person. He was trying to establish a cult of God himself, not of Jesus.
As regards the historical person, Yeshua of Nazareth, as the Stanford course has been saying, I couldn't agree with you more with respect to that historical person. On the other hand, I think we all understand that the character in the Gospels has a very limited, and in fact, from our to be rigorously historical, we have almost no idea whether or not such a person from Nazareth even related these stories at all. There are no eyewitness accounts or transcripts from the period.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just have to be careful that but the Gospels, I'm even taking the Gospels themselves without any sort of externalized reading or anything, that they disagree about what they're doing. I mean, John is doing something very different from what Mark is doing. Mark does not think of himself as a Christian in the sense, in any sense, whereas Luke maybe, and then you've got so I think it's very problematic to say that Jesus in these parables is trying to convert people to Christianity. That seems to me completely ahistorical and has very little to do with most of the Gospels.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that these are the Christian scriptures that we're reading here.
They're co-opted by Christianity for its own purposes, but whether we
wouldn't be reading if they hadn't been canonized. In fact, we haven't attempted to read any of the non-canonized versions.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to be careful about people who haven't read the Gospels or people who have read them in one way or another. It's just important to say that what's happening in these parables, say in particular, is in terms of the agenda of the author of that particular book, is varying. There isn't a consistent what is happening with parables in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Certainly when it comes to the politics of Christianity. People are putting parables in one book and not in another, all for completely different reasons. And I just don't want to suggest to people listening who might not have a clear idea about this, that there's a coherent idea of what parables are doing in the New Testament, as though God had written the New Testament and he says, well, this is what parables are for, and then everyone who reads it comes to this conclusion.
Right.
So there are different uses.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we could I think maybe really struggle. And I think during the podcast, the discussion with Law, etc., you could kind of feel some of that struggle to look at the whether the messages were consistent or what was really being said. If you were to look at them all as divine, the books that have made it to us canonized were divinely inspired, then we have a difficult story to tell as to how they all integrate and tell a coherent message. I don't know if any of you guys have read Don Cuppett's book. I think it's Jesus as Philosopher. Mark, have you read that?
It was one of the Cupid, I believe. Yeah, I know. I think I've heard him on a podcast. No, I haven't read it.
He's on Philosophy Bites. That's where I had heard him. Just a little snippet, but he goes to a great length to reference the Jesus seminars that you guys talked about, as to which of the words of Christ that have made it to us have a higher likelihood than others of actually being things that he has said. And so I think, while I think you could certainly get sidetracked and make it a whole historical discussion, it is important to know, have a perception of what the parables are before we try to ascribe the meaning to them. And if we're just going to take a subset of them, then what's the rationale for doing so? But going through that exercise, it might be easier. Cuppet or Cupid, if I'm mispronouncing his name, I think does a great job of sifting through that and showing that really where Jesus' novel is being one of the early moral philosophers, and that changing away from moral objectivism to more of the subjective morality based on interpersonal relationships and how you relate to individuals in the world, etc. And so I think from that perspective, a lot of the words of Christ in the parables in particular, for me anyway, have a much more impactful meaning. But I'm curious what you guys think. I'll stop yammering.
Well, I just want to say briefly that while I think it is probably legitimate that we take the parables out of their setting in the Gospels, I think it's probably legitimate for various historical critical reasons that I think they're probably inserted by the authors opportunistically one way or another. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we can just take the historical context away from a parable. So we certainly can't. So there has to be a mixture of responses, because if we just take if we just lift a parable out of the Bible, stick it on a wall in an art gallery, and say, "What do you think about this?" then we're doing something very different than anyone who's ever read the Bible, and something very different than anyone who's ever considered the parable in most other contexts. So we have to be careful that we don't, in yanking something out of its context, start ascribing it different properties or different characteristics because it happens to be put on a pedestal somewhere in a gallery or the mind of a philosopher. So we should keep in mind the constraints of the format that it's given in.
Well, speaking of that, one of the things that struck me going through this whole topic of the parables was how often in the stories one of the characters, quoted in the Gospels, will say, that Jesus was standing in the temple and talking to the scribes and learned men, or Jesus was walking with the disciples to Emmaus and enlightening them on the scriptures. And we don't have any recordings of or accounts of Jesus' intellectual conversations. What we have are these recordings of Jesus, little homilies, these little parables, which are speaking for myself, they're much less interesting as a philosopher than what he might have been saying to the Talmud scholars in the temple.
Well, in John we have Jesus giving a speech to Pontius Pilate about truth and stuff, and then he has his speech in the temple of his trial and things. So we do have certain intellectualized speeches, but they're never associated with the parables.
I was just thinking if Socrates had Plato following him around and memorizing his conversations, if Jesus had somebody comparable, we'd have a very different document in the New Testament.
I'm not convinced we would. I think we'd have something very, very similar to what we had in the New Testament, to be honest. I think because that's what they did. I just don't think Jesus was that bright. I think he was a preacher in the first century. I mean, his parables, the height of parables is the height of wit and intellect, and he did a pretty good job with it, nevertheless. But I don't think we're going to get ancient Greek metaphysics from an illiterate Galilean.
As I said, I'm not aware of any kind of documentary evidence. There's plenty of documentary evidence that somebody named Yeshua in Nazareth was around at this time, but I'm not aware of any documentary evidence that he said these things.
Well, yeah, I think we are perhaps veering too much into a different conversation, but
yeah.
For the moment, I think it's provisionally plausible that we attribute them to someone. They do seem to have come from somewhere.
With some variety, there have been a couple of studies as to which ones seem to be interpolated afterwards, and which ones are testified by more than one source. And
right.
It's been impossible for me to stop thinking about the life of Brian as we're trying to understand all this.
Don't be a follower. Be an individual. We are all individuals.
Yes. Not me, right?
Yeah, I'm not.
That's right.
That's right. Well, I did kind of think of it. I mean, the settings they have there with the desert landscapes and people wandering around, I guess I did have that in mind, maybe paraconsciously, in a way. That's how I think of Jesus as acting and behaving, as sort of draped in cloth wandering around in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, and all the factionalism I thought was very historically useful. There was a colonial power and a lot of fractionated opposition movements, and a lot of mutual misunderstanding among the actors at the time. So.
Yes.
Are there the actual parables that folks want to?
That's right.
Back to that. Yeah.
Well, what are parables?
Nick, what was the most interesting parable discussed or not discussed to you? You're muted. Okay.
Oh, I'm hitting the wrong buttons. The most interesting parable discussed. The ones around the financial aspects I thought were interesting, if only because if I remember correctly, we can find examples where prudence is really the word of the day, and others where it's go out and invest, and I think the go out and invest and make the most of what you have parable I think, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, that flew in the face of Jewish law, did it not? I mean, wasn't that...
It did, and I think that's why we should read it as not do it. I think we should read the rich person in that story as the evil mafia boss who's left some money lying around, and he's going to punish you if you don't do something with it. And I think the person who doesn't do something with it is the good guy of the story. So I don't think Jesus Christ is saying in a Sunday school way, oh, we're all good, we all have things to do, let's do those well. I think he's saying, you know, you're gonna be punished by people who are trying to sin, and you sort of have to just deal with it, and you have to sort of look past it, or something like that. I don't know.
There's a recurring theme in the New Testament about leaving one way of life and engaging upon another way of life, and that there will be some sacrifices in making that switch.
Mm-hmm.
So this particular parable fits very well into that pattern.
Does it? Go on. How?
I thought that's what you were saying.
It might be. Did I say that? I'm not sure that. Well, the thing is, I think the parable is about.
A mafia boss, right?
Yeah, it's. I mean, look, the Jews
And he's
of the time.
he's gonna punish you if you go straight.
Basically, yeah, I think. But I mean, I think the preoccupation here is with social justice, and I think that is actually the real preoccupation, not something being read into it. Because I think if you look at the history of Jewish stories of these kind as they recur from about 200 years before then to 100 years after then, you will find over and over and over again, oh, there are these rich people and they're doing horrible things, but we good Jews who keep the purity and keep the faith and etc., we will survive through it. Or you see the other side of it, you know, God will come down and save us all. So I think most of the time, well, not most of the time, some of the time he's saying apocalyptic things with parables, like the future will be different and you will have to be ready for it and you will have to change or something, which is sort of broadly apocalyptic ideas. Or he's saying something not like that, which is where he's saying, oh, just sort of just deal with the rich people, deal with the injustice, just sort of plant the seeds in the right place kind of thing. So I think he has two strands in the thought, and I wouldn't necessarily attribute both strands of thought to him as a person either, which is why there is a debate between, as we might know, people who take Jesus Christ to be an apocalyptic preacher or not. So there is a recurring theme of in some parables of changing and being radically different, and I think there's also a theme of how do you respond to a world which is unjust, is persecutory, is marginalizing, etc., and I think his response in those situations is usually sort of trusting God, or suffer through it, or keep going on in some way. So there's a conservatism to some parables and there's a radicalism to others. I think on the whole he comes out as being a radical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one interesting thing to ask when you find a corpus that's dividing into these two ways is, do we want to average between them, or do we want to find one being presented as a contrast to the other, or do we want to find two different topics being discussed, and there's one line taken in one topic and a different line taken in another topic? Where do we see these breaking up?
Well,
I want you to do a Gaussian blur.
My best guess would be that only one of them could actually be attributed to Jesus, and that the other, and it's kind of left for us to decide which one is which, is likely has been imposed in the text by the author for some other reason. We see a lot of that in terms of even elements of Christ's birth and the history, the short history of his life. The authors treat that very differently, and a lot of scholars, at least as I remember, will attribute many of which description of which details get included is really just dependent on the author and the author's intended audience at the time. So I don't know that there is a need to reconcile these contrary points. I think it's much more likely that only one of them actually represents his philosophy. And I like to put it into the context as well of what about his philosophy would have led to his death. And so if there are parables or the sermons, etc., that were just toeing the line of what everybody else was saying at the time, those aren't going to be the ones that are going to land him in trouble. But it's the ones, to the point earlier, maybe the more radical view, and I'll go back to that, the kind of the moral humanist view, that are the ones that get him in trouble. And at least from my perspective, for the convenience of my reading, are the ones that I assume are probably more likely his actual words.
So there's two, there's perhaps three responses to how we look at these parables. I mean, two of them might be that we just say Jesus was not a consistent preacher, and I find that very persuasive. I don't think we have to attribute some kind of pure ideological consistency to a person in order to, reconcile problems with what they're saying. I think you would find it very hard to listen to a person for 30 years and not find contradictions, not find changes of mind. And I think Jesus, if he was ever responding to situations appropriately and morally and trying to empathize and sympathize with the people of the situations he was in, would be saying different things to different people in the way that any preacher would do. You wouldn't just say, oh, well, you're in this predicament, but I'm going to tell you about this other predicament. Even in the way he seems to in some of the Gospels, he does seem to sort of talk past people sometimes. But I think that level of just unaware fervency or sort of deliberately ignorant fervency doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would be successful for a preacher in communities across a large region. I think you're going to have to be changing a message at some point and to respond to different people. But one way or another, even if you believe that, there's still a question of, is it possible to harmonize? How do we harmonize these things, even as an interpretive gesture? So not okay, even if this isn't one person speaking, even if there's several people speaking, what do we say of the community of people who would endorse these parables as something important, moral, instructive? How do we characterize that community of people? And I think we can. So there is an interpretive question there, even if we split it up into different people saying it. We say, well, what are the group doing? And the group are doing, I think, lots of different things. They're being conservative about some things and radical about others.
Well, yeah. So this is the question of whether we have the Gaussian blur, or whether we impose on ourselves as readers the challenge of making more sense out of whatever common threads we can find. And one thing I think is useful to keep in mind is that these four texts that we end up with in the canon that survives now, these were selected by church groups in various places in the first century from dozens, if not around 100 possible offerings of accounts of Jesus' life, and some of them fragmentary. And the authors of the texts that survive are undoubtedly not from among the original 12 disciples, if there were 12, that in the time of Jesus' own life, but they're collections or they were intellectual works by people who came after. In some cases, a generation or so after, in some cases a little more. Gary Wills has an interesting book, one about Jesus and another about Paul. And his opinion is that some of the epistles of St. Paul are the earliest Christian texts from the first century, and that the Gospels generally post-date some of those epistles. So we may have not so much the works of four separate authors as more the works of four separate committees that vetting texts and settling on an outcome, which I think weighs on the side of trying to find coherence in the picture that all the parables are contributing to.
Coherence meaning let's reestablish what Nicaea was thinking, what the way was thinking.
There was a council in Nicaea, and they were going to be arguing with each other more or less publicly, more or less like us.
Perhaps with more,
with less internet. Yeah. There's and an unknown amount of politics in the background as well.
Yeah. So the question, I suppose, for a set of parables is, I suppose the philosophical question here is to what extent do we have to count those in an analysis of the parables themselves? Because if you look, just read the parables. I mean, a lot of them are pericopopic, if you like, pericopopic, which means they do function independently of the surrounding text in a way, and in some situations function better if they don't have the surrounding text. That seems to be often a bit of a misdirection. So if we just sort of throw away all the politics and throw away all the penmanship of the author and just say, okay, someone said some of this stuff a while ago, what were they on about? That then opens up the space for philosophical questioning.
Yeah. Well, at some point you have to get down into the actual text and do the hermeneutics on it.
So how do we do a hermeneutics of a parable?
Well, my suggestion is to start with the mundane, everyday story, if it happens to be economic reasoning or shepherd reasoning or how to light the way of a wedding party, then we can go through the story the way we'd go through a news article and say, does this make sense? Do we understand the intentions and the opinions of the people who made those decisions? And we may end up with some variety, a variety of possible interpretations, but we can get something out of it at that level, and then we have to ask, what's the value of this kind of a story in accomplishing the theological objectives which we assume are present in this religious canon?
I think there's a step, potentially a step missing, or maybe I'm just doing it slightly differently.
Sure. Oh, sure. I'm being schematic.
But I mean, for me, I tend to take these things as establishing what I call an emotional economy, or where basically the stories are not working on a semantic level. It doesn't matter that this person has a particular name or a particular role or a particular thing. The only elements of the story that matter are those which establish an effect, an emotional effect in the person who's hearing it. And if they cause you to be angry, or cause you to be shocked, or cause you to be aroused, or whatever it may be, or tentative, then that's the sort of overriding function of the parable form. I mean, I was reading a transcript of a TED talk by a relatively famous African feminist, and I can't remember what it was called now, but I think it was Why Everyone Should Be a Feminist. It's just a book that's a transcript. And in that she has several parables, of what I would call parables, of life in Western Africa, I think, for her and for people like her, and they concern women and how they're treated and things like that. And I find myself, obviously I can connect to these things much better than I can connect to Jesus' parables, because I don't know about 10 virgins, but I do know about tips in restaurants. And it seems to me that the way she was talking, the way she was using these parables, was to either incite anger in me, or the reader, or the listener, or to get them to be, have this righteous indignation that something needs to change, and these kinds of things. And I think that is the kind of, you're trying to load a gun and point it in a direction with these things very often. So the theological accomplishment of them, I think, is secondary to the sort of actionable or active component of the effect that they have on a particular individual listening to something.
Okay, so you would compare the function of the parables to like what Aristotle is saying about tragedy, that it's the value of going there to experience it is the emotional effect it has on the audience. Am I understanding you?
Is it me, or is something not working?
I thought we
Yeah.
lost you for a second there, Michael.
Oh, right, okay, sorry, maybe you did. I thought I lost you all for a second.
Well, I've hidden myself for a little while because I'm so pooped out from the discussion I just had that I'm not contributing meaningfully. But by all means, go on. Let's
No.
maybe wrap it up in the next 15 minutes. Just
Thanks for jumping in and rescuing the discussion.
You know what? If I can, taking this back to an example parable, and I'm curious if you guys would agree or lend yourselves to an interpretation that I've come across recently. So back to the talents, bearing the talents, or reaping a profit from the talents. One of the interpretations, because if it was just taken purely financially, that whole thing I thought was kind of quirky and funny. Mark, I don't know if it was you or during the actual podcast, you said it wouldn't be a big leap to just say, "Hey, do the best with what you've got," right? Was that you who said
I think that is sort of the traditional interpretation that I've heard of.
Exactly. Now,
One that has talents. Your
yeah,
talent.
exactly right. Yeah, instead of the money denomination. The one that I've come across that from an evangelical perspective, I think that gets taught in churches, is that if we looked at God as the master in that parable or whatever he's referred to, and that
Sounds like heresy to me.
and if his followers are the servants, then they are admonished to go out and find ways to make a spiritual profit for the Father, for God, and then discussions ensue about what would that mean, and many people would interpret that as the call for evangelism, to go out and gain more souls in the service of God. What do you guys think about that? Is that a legitimate interpretation? Any thoughts on whether that would have been a part of the original intent? I'm just curious and throwing it out there.
Yeah, well, I think that fits into a reading of the parables where they're sort of like a fable. They're an attempt on the part of the speaker to give his audience an example of something that he wants them to either imitate or avoid, and they can take that example and apply it in their own lives. And if one of the goals of this young Christian community, or this community around Jesus, we can call it that, if it's one of their objectives to grow, to obtain more, to increase the membership in the community, then going out to use their abilities, use their efforts, to multiply themselves. That would fit right in with that pattern. So there's a pattern in the story of using the talents that you have to get more, and that pattern could be reproduced in a lot of different contexts. And a lot of the parables do lend themselves to that kind of reading. Here's somebody who's a good example. You should imitate him. Or in the parable of the virgins, they're a bad example. So half of them are a good example, half of them are a bad example.
Mm-hmm.
So now, my impression is that if we look at these parables in that way, just as examples for what people should do in their own life, and then I think we're missing the theological significance of them. Why does God need to incarnate himself into the form of Jesus and then get crucified? So one of the things I would say we need to look for in these parables is we need to find some event that corresponds to an individual sacrificing their entire life, for the benefit of somebody else, or some larger community, because Jesus, the historical person, may not have had that in mind, to get himself crucified, but that's certainly the story that's being told in the Gospels. Jesus is here for a very specific purpose, and he's aware of it, and he wants that event of his incarnation and death to have the maximum impact on human society as possible. And for some reason, telling these parables was part of that. So I think we're missing the point of the Christian document if we don't find a role for the parables in the incarnation in a wider, theological sense. So it's great to find, ordinary, moral theory or more, moral edification in any of these stories, but and of course a big part of the Christian project is moral edification of the populace at large. But there's still this other question to ask. Why would God go to all this trouble to, or if part of the story is God went to all this trouble to incarnate himself and get crucified, and that's going to let us all have the chance to go to heaven, which is kind of a big thing, then what's the role of the stories in getting that larger purpose?
And have you gone through that exercise at all? Do you without? And I guess I'm curious if that could be done without massively torturing the text.
Oh, that's the. I was talking about that earlier. I think that was Kierkegaard's project, and he applied it primarily to his first great example of applying that was to the story of Abraham and Isaac, and I think Kierkegaard does a pretty good job. But
if I might just say briefly,
sure,
that Paul does the same thing to the Hebrew Bible, right? The characters in the New Testament and the authors of the New Testament are not literalists about the Old Testament. They freely grab bits and pieces of it and completely run with completely non-literal interpretations of it. Just seem to be freestyling at points, right? If you look at what Paul says about Hagar and Sarah and so on, that just seems to have really little to do with anything the text is actually saying. So it seems that the people of the time certainly weren't at all relating to these, maybe not even producing them, but certainly not relating to them as though they were sort of... The way I like to think of it is, the way I was thinking of it is, as songs, when you listen to a song, like Michael Jackson's song, Billie Jean or something, do you think that Billie Jean exists? Does that make a difference to the meaning of the song? I think he has a line of 40 days and 40 nights in there as well, actually. But so the way I was going to write a little blog post on this, but I thought I can't be bothered. But I thought that maybe you should think about these parables as a bit like lyrics to songs, in a way that they establish narrative structures, they establish ways of relating to things, emotional engagement and stuff. But trying to say, is there a person called Billie Jean, seems to miss the point of the whole enterprise.
Sure.
I think that's very similar, if I understand you right, to the young Joseph Campbell kind of pathway, right? Is the looking at the meaning behind the text is more important than any historicity. And I think didn't even Kierkegaard point that out as well, that we will never really know historically any of this stuff, but what's the meaning behind it?
Yes. One of the characteristics of philosophical problems is that we think of them as problems that, at least some philosophical problems, are things that anybody has to face. Like, how do I decide what to do with myself? Ethical problems and epistemological problems are universal problems, and you can perform some kind of conceptual work on them in a work of pure fiction. And there's whole reading groups on the Partially Examined Life site that are doing just that.
If I might just introduce the Constitution, the United States Constitution here at least, you have originalists and you have I don't want to call them liberals, who would certainly be a misnomer. What's the word for it? People who are sensible. Let's put it that way. You have originalists and you have people who are sensible, and the thing is that both of them are taking the texts in ways that would be recognizable to the person who wrote them, right? When someone adds an amendment to the Constitution and says, people should be, well, men should be equal in this particular way, if you come back to them and say, oh, we expanded that to include women, black people, and they would go back to you and say, oh yeah, I can see how you kind of got that from what we said. That's kind of what we meant. We were kind of thinking, yes, there's some kind of equality between people in a way. And an originalist could say, oh, well, no, we shouldn't do that. What we really should do is say exactly what you said, which is all men are equal. And he could say, oh, yeah, I can see what you mean there. That is true. We did say that. Maybe we meant something broader. We don't know. Maybe the guy around the corner meant something different. But that's not necessarily what Kierkegaard is doing with Abraham and Isaac. He's not taking either of those two positions. And I don't think that's what we're doing with the parables when we take either of those two positions.
But it would make sense if you take, all this going through the historical Jesus stuff just made me think of the Bible as a group written document, and that's fine. That it was, it was reflecting a tradition, and if you don't get so hung up on what did this one guy say about, we're trying to talk about him as a philosopher, as an individual. So yes, we did have to try to consider that to the degree that it could be tried, but I'm less interested in that. If this is a fulfilling, rich tradition, then I don't care if Augustine wrote it or Kierkegaard wrote it or Tillich wrote it or anybody from any of the periods. I mean, this is just a bunch of wisdom that has grown up over the time. I wanted to, visit the parables that maybe are some of the first bits of that to see where they came from. But I suppose though that reflects more my theological openness to the idea of Jesus' divinity means that we're all God in some sense. That which is not an Orthodox Christian view at all. So,
right.
Well, I agree with you, but I just want you to be clear that what was being so what was being implied was maybe that we're revisionists and maybe that we're being good interpreters, right? But I think the things that we're doing when we read the parables today would be completely unrecognizable to the original authors of those parables. So, Anthony Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg could have their own conversations with Thomas Jefferson, and I'm sure they'd be profitable. I don't think our interpretation of the 10 virgins or the certainly not the talents one, I don't think our interpretation would be at all recognizable. I think we're doing so much reconstruction when we take them out of their historical context, that we are just operating under we're not even responding to what Jesus or whoever wrote them was saying. We're not responding to it anymore. We're responding to words that have acquired a different meaning over history. We're responding now to some kind of we're responding to millennia now rather than to a particular time and a particular text. We're responding to culture as we've inherited it, and as it appears in these words. And I think if we're going to do that, we can do, but we have to be aware that we're maybe completely missing out on something else.
Yeah, there's no question, at least for me, that the text is a patchwork quilt with many different contributors that had different thoughts and minds and different types of fabric and colors at their disposal. They were making the quilt, I think, for all different reasons. And while I agree that there is value in the composite, I think the value is more what's behind it culturally that allowed it to become so influential in society, rather than the contents or even most of this kind of specific stories and words. Divine, historical, etc. That there's something beyond it, behind it. Is it just the kind of the moral humanism aspect? Is it really just an accident of history that Constantine brought this in for his political and other reasons? And it's just been an accident of history. It feels like there's more to it than that, but I don't think it's inherent in the text or the stories itself.
Oh, well, one of the things that I've become more and more impressed with in Christianity over the years is that there was a long tradition in human history of people being born into a religion, or an entire nation having a religion, and the issue of choosing what religion you would follow just wasn't a part of the picture of religion at all. It had choosing which church to go to had just wasn't part of the picture. And around the time of Christianity, and Christianity may have been one of the originating movements of this type, but religions that involve a conversion. Buddhism is an example. Christianity is another example. And in Christianity could have picked up this concept out of Greek thought. There was a lot of Greeks did a lot of deciding which cult they would follow. But
well, if you do
it didn't
anything
happen
like
only
that,
in the Middle East. It happened also in India. Yeah. So.
well, if you engage in any of that kind of activity, you can't have a patriotic or nationalist element to your religion.
Yeah, well,
and Greek thought was often very cosmopolitan. But I think if you look at contemporary Christianity, however, I think it certainly isn't the case that the Christians in America identify more with Christians in Palestine than they do with Muslims in America. I think a Muslim in America could have a conversation with a Christian in America, where a Palestinian Christian and an American Christian would have nothing to do. There are a lot of insults and all kinds being thrown between them, no doubt.
Yeah, well, there's a tendency for a society, for any group of people, there's a tendency to avoid making choices, or tendency to avoid using one's freedom of choice. People have this tendency to go along with a crowd, and we have plenty of criticism of that phenomena in Nietzsche. But a lot of the parables, I think, depict characters making a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And from one point of view, the choice they make might be questionable. And in many of the cases, the choice that they're making is risky. And in some cases, the choice comes out wrong. And in some cases, the choice comes out right. And so this is one of my overarching themes that I find in the parables, that Christianity is introducing into the ancient world the potential significance of an individual choice in a way that wasn't really in the foreground of a lot of at least of ordinary people's thinking, for a long time before. And now the parables also depict some of that, people making a choice that could turn out to be big.
I think that's a little bit of later interpolation going on there, but I can see what you mean. I mean, it certainly is introducing a crisis of a moment where people have to invest one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of choosing between religions, I mean, as I said very earlier on, I don't think most of the people involved in the New Testament thought of themselves as establishing a new religion that Jews would have to choose. I mean, if you look at Paul's project, he just didn't give a damn whether the Gentiles were behaving as Jews or not. He just wanted to bring them all in and tell them all the good news. So I don't think he was even really saying that the Gentiles should make a choice in the way that Jesus Christ was saying in the parables, with establishing that. So I can sort of buy that maybe there's some kind of existential element to these parables where there's a moment of crisis where the future is different than now, and you sort of invest one way or another. But
that's exactly
loath
what
to couple that to a cutesy religious conversion thing.
No. The existential moment is exactly what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, and I'd be really curious to learn more about how likely folks were through history to, how much kind of mobility there was between different faiths or kind of subsets of faiths. I've never actually really thought about that, but when you started this line of discussion, my first thought was, it really hasn't changed, has it? I mean, we certainly have the right to believe anything we want, and we can come and go as we please, but overwhelmingly, I mean, the actual percentage has to be way over 95% of children fall into the faith of their parents. I mean, does anybody disagree? Do we see a lot of lateral movements, conversions one way or the other?
No. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I'm taking my reading from Kierkegaard as much as I can. And Kierkegaard himself, on the one hand, he emphasizes the importance of this existential choice. On the other hand, he is very critical of established religion and habitual behavior in the form of church-going and conventionalized morality, and he would adopt exactly the same figure that you're suggesting. You know, it's the overwhelming majority of people aren't, you know, using Christianity or any element of the Christian story to make an existential choice. They're really just going along with the mob.
Right, and is it a fair characterization to say that the existential choice? I don't know who coined the term, but you know, you're standing in front of a Pepsi machine and you want a Coke. You're not going to get a Coke, right? There's only so many choices in front of you, and the existential choice, I would assume, is really more about your relationship to God on a personal level, than whether or not you're going to, you know, decide to, you know, worship a Hawaiian idol. I mean, is that accurate?
Well, there's two things that I would mention. One is a comment of Jesus, like, and this is a theme that comes up over and over in the New Testament. You know, Jesus says that anyone who wants to follow me, they're going to have to give up their father and mother. So he's emphasizing to his audience that he's offering them a situation in which some kind of change is important, and there's going to be some losses involved. They're going to lose. And he says things like, you should ignore earthly treasures, but lay up treasures in heaven, where, you know, neither moth nor rust corrupt, etc., etc. Yeah. So there's the theme of choice, I think, is very prominent in the New Testament. But the other thing I want to mention is the Egyptian history and the movement to worship a single, you know, monotheistic sun god at the time of Akhenaten. So this is like 3,000 years before Christ, you know? And so that's one of the great eruptions in human history of an invented religion, and it worked very badly. Akhenaten was, you know, put down, and the Egyptians all went back to their polytheism.
Yeah.
Well, I think Christianity. Well, if you're going to call this Christianity, I think Christianity at the time is polytheistic, or at least henotheistic. I mean, you know, so. I wouldn't necessarily say that at the moment these things were being written, you were establishing monotheism. I think it probably came perhaps several hundred years later.
I thought you were going to introduce, isn't it the little Freud book, Moses and Monotheism, where he supposes that was the birth of monotheism, was that
revisionism.
Right. That's what I had in mind.
Yeah.
I think that's just him patting the Jews in the back because he is one. I don't think. No, I think, you know. I think if you were to go back to an ancient person and say, "Well, what's your picture of the world? Is there one God?" I'm not convinced that they don't conceive as angels in the same way that we would conceive as pagan gods as being gods and things. These are not cleanly monotheistic in the nice sort of Jeffersonian way where you can say, "Oh, well, you know, some guy out there is looking down on us all."
From an existential, let me just hop in. From the point of view of existentialism, it's less significant whether there's a monotheism in any technical sense, as opposed to whether or not there's a choice between following one way of belief and one way of life versus another. So that's all. I didn't want to get into monotheism as a topic, just to say that there had been occurrences in the past.
Well, you know, and I think kind of circling back to some places we've been, when you point out some of the words that really resonated with me when I was brought up in the Lutheran tradition and since different paths, but that you know, some of his language that was really radical. That was, you know, you were going to have to take this difficult road if you want to get cool with me. It's that kind of language, I think, that at least in my mind is most likely is really things he said, is most likely the kind of talk that got him killed, and for me, on a personal level, makes him like the all-time coolest hippie ever, right? I mean, it's that kind of relationship and eschewing of the classic norms and the patriarchy of the time that
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a bit of romanticism here.
Oh, no doubt.
I think
I fully admit that.
if you put yourself in a nice gentle cotton tunic of the time, wander around with a few golden rings on, and look around and think to yourself, well, this society is going pretty well. I mean, we're doing quite well. We have nice peace. We've had a peace for quite a while. Now this rabble-rousing idiot's coming along and starting saying things that were getting people all uppity. I think you might have a very different view of what Jesus was doing if you thought it was destabilizing society that was working so well. And I'm not convinced that he wasn't doing that. In the way that I'm not convinced that we should just exonerate Socrates, that there is an element of perhaps even a needless or aggressive dissent that just didn't have to exist. So, we have to be careful about romanticizing this thing. But I wanted to introduce a term that's often used today in certain aspects of continental philosophy, especially with Zizek. There's always a return to something. We're returning to Freud, we're returning to Hegel, we're returning to Schopenhauer, we're always returning to something. And what they mean is that not that we're repeating it. What they mean is not that we're lifting what they said and taking it as it stood and rehearsing it, but it means that we're taking the moment that these people were in, the moment that Hegel was in, the moment that Schopenhauer was in, and trying to reconstruct what their problems and concerns were, and sort of having a go at it ourselves. So when you repeat Freud or when you repeat Lacan, you don't just make the same mistakes those people made. You try and tackle the things in a similar way. You try and tackle the same problems, but knowing what's happened all the way throughout history since they existed. So trying to do what Freud would do today if he were alive, for example. And in that sense, you might say that, for example, Kierkegaard was returning to Jesus, if we take Jesus as being an existential prophet of some kind. But it's a question then whether you can return to these parables in that sense.
Well, I think that's Kierkegaard's assumption exactly. And in fact, he uses the term simultaneity. And for Kierkegaard, the essential the way of life of a contemporary, of a Christian in our own time, his own time or our own time, in any time, is trying to be simultaneous with Christ. And it's not entirely clear to me why he uses precisely that term. But he's very insistent on it and very systematic.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing because Cornel West has a rant he does about Obama where he says that he took MLK's Bible to the inauguration, he put his hand on it, and then he did all these things, and he congratulated Martin Luther King for doing all these wonderful things for black people, and then he just threw it all away. Martin Luther King was really about social justice, it was really about helping the poor out, it was really about all these big causes, and Obama did none of that. He just used his name in vain almost. So there's this tension, I think, between, in the same way, between modern Christianity and its relationship to Jesus, that I think people are putting their hand on the Bible and going blah 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 blah, but they're not enacting what Jesus was trying to do. Whether they're trying to do that literally by taking the text directly and trying to reconstruct it, or even just by having the same kind of sentiment. But whether we ought to do that, that's a different question, right? I mean, it seems that people aren't doing that, but whether we ought to do that is a different thing. I mean, the times have changed. Should we really be ranting in the same way?
Oh, well, I think your point about liberation theology from earlier is very well taken on exactly this subject. There's one of the great questions for a secular person looking at the Bible is to say, is the fundamental significance of this text only for people who are afraid of burning in hell, and instead of that want to spend eternity in heaven? Or is the significance of this text at least partly in terms of people who want to make this earth a better place here while we happen to be alive and walking around on it? And liberation theology adopts at least some of the latter view, that some people who are engaged in liberation theology may be very much eternity-oriented, but I would say that that dimension of Catholicism has diminished to some extent, and there's a lot more people who are interested in social justice and sacrificing for it.
Yes. So, hello, Mark. I think I'm going to pop off now.
It's been a good long talk.
Yeah.
Can't hear anything you're saying though. You're on mute.
Oops.
Let's grind this thing to a halt. I thank you all for participating.
Thank you so much. This was a blast. Absolute. Sorry to have joined late.
Great. Thanks. It's good talking with you all.
You too. Take care.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.